keeps saying no sound detected, but I think there's sound.
Today's Christmas-themed story is a stark reminder that there are truly dangerous and unstable people who walk among us. But before we get into that story,
All right,
if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in
gotta get
story
the
format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do.
gotta get the
We
village
upload
ready.
once a week. So if that's of interest to you,
All right,
please
let me
invite the
change.
like button to go fishing with you. But when you're out on the water,
Let me not
and
use
the like
this right
button
now.
asks you, what are we
Ooh.
using for bait? Say nothing and
Round
just
ass
stick your hook
head.
into the like button
All right.
and cast them out into the water. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the evening of December 20th, 2022, a young woman named Moon Soo-ho, along with her boyfriend, whose name was Lee Ki-young, sat at a table at a Korean barbecue restaurant in northern Seoul, which is the capital city of South Korea. The couple didn't even have any food yet, but Moon was not even looking at the menu. Instead, she was excitedly checking her watch, waiting for her parents to arrive.
I have to take
This
some
dinner
pictures
was a
of
very
it though, because
special
then I'll
occasion for
forget.
Moon,
I'll
because she
forget
had
what I
been
have to
dating
do.
Lee for several months now, and she was totally in love with him, but she had not introduced him to her parents yet. And so Lee had surprised her with reservations to this restaurant tonight for 4 people. He had invited her parents to come to the dinner so they could all finally meet. Moon looked across the table at Lee and she smiled, because she knew as soon as her parents saw this guy, they were going to be impressed. Lee was a 32-year-old Army veteran with lots of crazy stories from his time in the military. He was also exceptionally good looking, he was very well educated, and he came from
He's
a
just
family
like me,
that
for
was
real.
extremely successful and very wealthy. Lee's grandfather owned the high-rise building that Lee was staying in. I mean, this family was very influential and powerful in South Korea. But Lee was not full of himself. He was very humble, he was kind and polite, and he had a total soft spot for little animals. He had adopted a dog and 3 cats and adored them. I mean, this was a guy who was kind of like the
I'm
total
stopping
package
just
that
so I
any
could take
parent would be psyched
pictures
if
of
their
it, and
daughter
I
was
can
dating.
actually build it
After
on
Moon
the
and Lee had been
survival
sitting at this
one.
table for about 15 minutes, Moon looked up and she saw her parents finally coming in the door.
Because
So
I
Moon, she stood up and she
cannot
waved to her
remember it.
parents and flagged them over to the table. And so they came over, they said hi to Lee, and right away Lee, he picked up the menu and he ordered all these very expensive drinks and all the expensive meats on the menu. And then before long, Lee was chatting with Moon's father about his military service. And then Lee was
Okay,
talking
it's
to Moon's
8.
mother and showing
Somebody
her
remember
pictures of his
8.
dog and his 3 cats. And Moon, she was just sitting back, enjoying watching this because she could see from her parents' facial expressions that they seemed to really like Lee too. And so this night was going as good as it could have. Moon and Lee and Moon's parents stayed at this restaurant for at least
All right,
2 hours,
I think
just
I should be
enjoying each
good.
other's company and throwing back a lot of drinks and eating expensive food. And by the end of the night, when the parents got up to leave, they were like hugging Lee and slapping him on the back. And
Bro,
telling him
Mr.
how
Ballin
great he
is one of the
was.
most
And Lee was doing
entertaining
the same thing to the
storytellers.
parents. It was like really they had hit it off. But after Moon's parents were gone, Moon and Lee, they left the restaurant too, and they began walking across the street towards the parking garage where Lee had parked. And right away, Moon could tell Lee was actually pretty drunk. She had not noticed it in the restaurant, but now she could see Lee was kind of stumbling a little bit. But Moon wasn't upset about this. If anything, she just thought, wow, he was so composed talking to my parents in there, despite obviously being drunk. He had just managed to mask it really, really well. But despite how impressed she was with her boyfriend, Moon didn't want Lee to drive them home. It seemed like that would be really unsafe to do because, again, obviously he is drunk. And so when Lee and Moon made it to Lee's car, Moon kind of gently told Lee, hey, why don't we leave your car here and just call a taxi and they can take us home safely. But when she said this, Lee took it as if Moon was criticizing him for being too drunk. And he felt really offended because in his mind, he had just put on this great date and made this great first impression on Moon's parents, and here she is kind of nagging him. And so Lee just kind of blew his lid, and the couple got in this horrible yelling fight in the parking garage.
Okay, it's eight floors,
with Lee telling Moon that their relationship was now over, and then Lee turned around and stormed off to hail a cab by himself. And after he was gone, Moon just stood there next to Lee's car.
8. Oh my god, I'm too good.
What had just happened? And then kind of in a daze, she went and hailed a cab herself and went home, and then she just laid in bed and cried until she went to sleep. But Moon was not heartbroken for long, because the next morning when Moon woke up, she heard a knock on the front door, and when she opened it up,
those knocks always get me. I gotta stop listening to this.
Bouquet of roses for Moon. And so Moon took these roses and quickly found a card attached to the roses. She opened it up, and there was a letter from Lee saying, please accept these roses as a part of my apology. Last night didn't go so well. I'm really sorry. Please come to dinner with me tonight. Moon was so relieved to get this apology letter that she called Lee right away and said, you know what, I do forgive you. It's all water under the bridge. My parents, they loved you and they have no idea about that fight we had. So let's just put it behind us and just continue being boyfriend and girlfriend. And at this point, it was Lee's turn to be totally relieved because he didn't know if Moon would want him back. But they were back together, and that night they went out for a fancy dinner together, and then also Lee had booked a very fancy hotel room that night for them to stay in. And this is really how their relationship went for the next couple of days. Basically, Lee would take Moon out shopping anywhere she wanted to go. They went to all the best restaurants and stayed in the best hotels. To Moon, it was obvious that Lee was really just continuing to shower her with gifts and praise and all these fun things to still try to make up for that big fight they got into, even though Moon really had forgiven him. And at some point, after several days of being treated like a princess by Lee, Moon finally told Lee, stop buying me stuff, it's fine, I totally forgive you, everything is good. But Lee insisted that he be allowed to continue to spoil her. After all, it was the Christmas season, and she deserved to be spoiled around Christmas. So in South Korea, Christmas is celebrated a bit differently than it is in Western countries like America. In South Korea, Christmas is a big holiday, but it's really just a holiday for couples. It's not really a family occasion. So in South Korea, on Christmas, lots of couples will go out on these fancy dates, and so that's kind of how they celebrate Christmas. Whereas, in Western countries like America, it's all about family and waking up and getting presents from Santa Claus. So that's the difference. Western is family-centric, and in South Korea, it's very couple-centric. It's kind of like Valentine's Day in the winter. So, on Christmas Eve, Lee told Moon that he had a very special dinner planned for Christmas, and would Moon mind coming over to Lee's apartment on Christmas morning to feed his cats and his dog, because Lee was going to be out running errands in preparation for this big Christmas dinner. And of course, Moon said she would. So, at around 11 a.m. on Christmas Day, Moon hopped off the elevator inside of Lee's apartment building and began walking down the hall towards his door, carrying the key to his door. But as Moon walked closer and closer to Lee's door, she began smelling this really powerful smell. It smelled like roses. And for a second, Moon thought to herself, oh my goodness, this whole thing was a setup. I'm not here to feed his pets. I'm here because he must have planned some really elaborate thing for Christmas Day.
Nah, you about to die, bro. Get out of there.
It has to do with lots of roses inside of his apartment.
Get out of
And so Moon was really excited by the time she got out front of Lee's apartment door. But before she used her key to open it up and just go in, she decided she would just call out for Lee, because she figured at this point, he's got to be in there. He knows I'm about to be surprised by this big thing. And so she calls out for Lee, but there's no answer. And so she knocks a couple of times to see if maybe she can get Lee to come to the door, but after knocking several times, there was no answer. So eventually, Moon used her key, she opened up the door, she swung it open, and she stepped inside of Lee's apartment, expecting to be wowed by whatever Lee had planned. But instead, when she looked around, she couldn't really understand what she was even seeing. Lee was nowhere to be found, but there were roses all over the apartment. However, these were not new roses. These were like several days old. Many of them were wilted and the petals were starting to fall off, and the water that all these roses were sitting in was very dirty. But really, there were like vases of roses everywhere on every surface. And right away, Moon started to feel really uneasy. It was like very creepy to be in this dark apartment where no one's inside of, with just these weird flowers everywhere. And so without going any further into the apartment,
I gotta
Moon
put some
once
floors
again yelled out for
I'm
Lee
gonna die in
in
there.
hopes that maybe he was here, but again, he didn't come out of any of the rooms, so she knows she's alone. And so she called Lee on his phone to try to get an explanation for what she was looking at. But Lee didn't answer his phone. By this point, Lee's 3 cats were circling around Moon's legs because they were eager to be fed, and so Moon kind of stopped thinking about this strange flower situation and looked over at the cats' bowls and saw there was no dry food. They had eaten all of their food. And so Moon began walking over to the bowls when she realized Lee had not told her where he kept the cat food, and so she had no idea where it was. So Moon began opening all the kitchen cabinets, hoping to find this cat food somewhere, but she didn't, and so eventually she left the kitchen and she walked down this hallway inside of the apartment, and she found there was a skinny closet in the hallway that looked like a place where you would store cleaning supplies and vacuums and that sort of thing. So she reached down and tried to open it. But she was able to turn the doorknob, but there was something inside of this closet that was making it really hard to open, like it was stuck on something. Now, again, Moon is kind of looking around this dark, dingy apartment that's filled with all these wilted roses.
All right, then I
She's
guess I'll
feeling
use
super uneasy, but she thought, you know, I just want to feed these cats and just get out of here. And so Moon just grabbed that door handle and yanked as hard as she could, and she managed to pop it open. And for a second, Moon just stared at the inside of the closet, having no idea what she was even looking at. And then she started to scream. One of the most terrifying places in the entire world is a place called Skinwalker Ranch in Utah. There have been so many unexplained occurrences on this property that government agencies have been sent to this ranch to basically do an investigation, and a lot of what they found is classified. I actually covered the Skinwalker Ranch story early on in my YouTube career, but the reason I covered it is because I watched another video, which was way better than mine, about Skinwalker Ranch, and it was by my favorite YouTube channel by far back then and still today, and that is, of course, Bedtime Stories. Their coverage of Skinwalker Ranch is
that's the one.
terrifying. The scene where one of these things is outside the door of this house and they're tapping on the walls, it's like the most unsettling thing I've ever seen on YouTube. And if you don't know this by now, we, Ballin Studios, were lucky enough to secure Bedtime Stories on our roster, and they now produce a weekly podcast where new episodes come out every single Wednesday. But this week, to celebrate Christmas, they're going to be releasing 3 new episodes, and they are all about Skinwalker Ranch. Also, stick around till the end of this video because we're going to play a sneak peek from one of those 3 episodes. It would turn out virtually everything Moon thought she knew about Lee, her boyfriend, was wrong. 5 days earlier, after Moon and Lee had gotten into that horrible fight in the parking garage following the dinner with Moon's parents, Lee had made it seem like he was storming off to go hail a cab and drive home on his own. But in reality, after he stormed off, he waited for Moon to walk away and get a cab on her own, and then Lee just walked right back over to where he had parked his car in the parking garage. He got inside, turned it on, and began driving home. But on his drive home, he actually crashed into a taxi driver. Now, neither Lee nor the taxi driver were harmed in this accident, and both cars were still drivable, but Lee actually had a really big problem with drinking and driving. 9 years earlier, in 2013, when Lee was serving in the military, he was put in military prison for drunk driving. And then after he got out of the military, he was arrested 2 more times for drunk driving in 2018 and 2019. And so even though this accident with the taxi driver was very minor, Lee did not want to go to police and report this accident because if officials got involved, they would see that Lee has this horrible history of drunk driving and he would get in way more trouble. And so Lee convinced the taxi driver to just allow him to pay him privately for the damages in order to avoid getting officials involved. However, the taxi driver, who was open to this, demanded that Lee pay him in cash. He didn't want some sort of deferred payment plan. He wanted to be paid now. And so Lee said, okay, well then let's go to my apartment and I'll just pay you there. However, when the taxi driver and Lee got to Lee's apartment, they got in a fight over how much money Lee actually needed to pay the taxi driver for the damages. And eventually, Lee just kind of snapped and beat the taxi driver to death, and then stuffed his body inside of that cleaning closet in his apartment's hallway. And so that's what Moon had seen when she had opened up that closet. She saw the corpse of the taxi driver. And then after Lee had murdered the taxi driver, he stole the taxi driver's credit cards and his cell phone, and Lee would use the taxi driver's credit card to pay for all those lavish dinners and hotel stays and gifts over the next few days as Lee spoiled Moon for Christmas. And also during that time, Lee was using the taxi driver's cell phone to send messages to the taxi driver's family to convince them that he was still alive. Also, Lee went out and bought a whole bunch of bouquets of roses and put them all over his apartment to try to mask the smell of the rotting corpse inside of his closet. But this murder and Lee's horrible drunk driving were not his only secrets. Lee claimed he was from this very wealthy, successful family that owned all these amazing high-rises in South Korea, but that was all a big lie. Lee was not from a very successful family. He did not have any.
This guy's gonna start throwing rocks
at
me. I know it.
Just borrowed money.
I swear to God, bro. Don't do it.
And then lied about.
I hate you.
Also, when the police in South Korea began investigating,
you're a little bit late. You're a little bit late, bro.
They discovered that Lee's apartment was not even his. It belonged to his ex-girlfriend, who was a bartender in South Korea who was in her 50s. Also, Lee's beloved 3 cats and dog that he talked about all the time, about how much he loved them and cared for them, well, those weren't his either. Those were his ex-girlfriend's. And as police continued their investigation into the murder of this taxi driver, they would eventually find traces of Lee's ex-girlfriend's blood inside of Lee's apartment, so his ex-girlfriend's apartment. And they would discover that Lee had murdered his ex-girlfriend, stolen her apartment, stolen her pets, and even took her cell phone, and to this day had been sending messages to her family to try to convince them that she was still alive, even though nobody had seen her and had no idea what was going on with her. Lee was ultimately arrested for 2 counts of murder, and he would quickly admit that he did kill the taxi driver.
Are you being hit? Oh my God, how did you get up here, bro?
However, by this point, police had located the cell phone
That's
of the
messed up.
missing
He wants to
woman
throw me out.
amongst
Let's see.
Lee's things, and so they became
Oh
very
shit, what the
suspicious
fuck?
that he might have had something to do
Where are
with
they
this
coming
third
from,
woman's
dog?
disappearance. However, to this day,
back
Lee
up,
has
back up,
denied
buddy.
having anything to do with this missing woman,
I
and
gotta
they
go
still
take more
have no
pictures.
idea what happened to her, and so that case is kind of on hold. Despite how totally crazy this whole story sounds, the craziest part actually happened after Lee was arrested. Once Lee's crimes were being talked about all
you're
over
good,
the
bro, you're
news,
good.
Lee became totally famous in South Korea because he was exceptionally good looking. On the news, they would play CCTV footage of Lee interacting with that taxi driver before he murdered him, and the only takeaway from lots of people in South Korea was, wow, this guy is so unbelievably attractive. He looks like an actor. Not, here's a guy who's about to murder someone. In fact, Lee became so popular in South Korea for being so beautiful that there became a real fear that Lee's ex-girlfriend, Moon, would become a target in some way. That maybe Lee's fans would blame her for putting their beloved Lee in prison, and they might try to attack her. However, the police in South Korea did a really good job of masking Moon's identity, and so to this day, we believe she is still safe. And also, for clarity, Moon is actually not her real name. That is a pseudonym that we used to protect her identity as well. In the end, Lee was sentenced to life in prison for those 2 murders. One of the most terrifying places in the entire world is Skinwalker Ranch in Utah. And this week, as part of a special Christmas release, Bedtime Stories, the podcast, who is part of the Ballin Studios network, is going to be releasing 3 episodes about Skinwalker Ranch. And as promised, here is a sneak peek from one of those episodes.
Did I just put it wrong or something? What wall did I use here?
In the new year, as the spring rains began to lash the ranch, the family would lose even more cattle. But now they began to reappear, sometimes dead from no apparent cause, other times extensively mutilated.
Is it this one?
The nature of these mutilations was bizarre. Huge chunks of flesh and skin were carved out of the animals, yet there was no blood.
Oh, I used
The wounds
this one.
always seemed to be cut with precision instruments, displaying an
Okay.
almost surgical quality rather than the savage tearing of animal predators.
All
The
right.
Shermans were feeling the stress caused by these
Kurokashi!
losses. Throughout 1995,
What up? What
the
up,
strange
bro?
activity only intensified.
Kurokashi!
Events took place that were frankly beyond bizarre.
Get this
So
sad
that's going to
person
do
out
it.
of my
If you got something out of today's story,
out of my chat
be
too.
sure to check out our podcast,
Que rollo,
the
que
Mr.
rollo.
Ballin Podcast, where we have hundreds more stories, a lot like this one, that are available to listen to right now. But many of them on this podcast are only available on the podcast. They are not on YouTube. Again, that podcast is called the Mr. Ballin Podcast, and it's available on Amazon Music.
Puro Mr. Ballin.
Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction, and today we're going to look at 3 stories that demonstrate that. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time you're at the Like Button's house and need to use their bathroom, don't use their toilet paper. Instead, use dozens and dozens of quadruple ply paper towels. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories.
I think my mouse is about to run out of battery.
Around 7:20 p.m. on the evening of December 11th, 2002, a police department in a rural English county called Surrey started receiving all these frantic emergency calls. Now, all of these calls were coming from drivers on a heavily trafficked highway called the A3, and they all were saying the same things. They had seen this totally reckless driver with
Bro, I
super
use
bright headlights
Mr. Ballin
who was
for
weaving
everything.
in and out of traffic and
Yes.
going at high speeds and nearly crashing into people.
I use Mr.
And
Ballin
a couple
to
of the
get
callers said
freaky,
they
dude.
actually saw this car go down the embankment off the side of the highway, and so it looked like they might have crashed. And so, of course, this police department, after getting all these calls, decided to send out a couple of officers to see what was going on. When the 2 officers got out to the A3 and began patrolling the area on the A3 where all these calls were saying they had seen this reckless driver, they didn't see the driver. They didn't see a wreck on the side of the road. They didn't see any signs of an accident. I mean, there was nothing there. Now, had only one person called in about this wild, reckless driver, at this point, the officers would have chalked this up to a mistake or even a prank. But so many people called in about this one
Oh, no,
particular
it's gonna
reckless
fit.
driver on the A3 that these 2 officers decided to just keep on looking and really see if
Look
they
like
can
it's gonna
figure out
fit.
where this driver went. And so to this point, the 2 police officers had been just driving on the A3 to try to find this driver. And so they decided they would park their vehicle, get out, and walk on foot on the edge of the highway because there were these huge forests that lined either side of the A3. In fact, Surrey, the county in England where this was one of the most heavily forested areas in all of England. And so these forests on either side of the A3 were very dense. You could not see very far into them. And so these officers were thinking that it might be possible that this driver, if they were driving as recklessly as all the callers made it seem like, they could have veered off the highway, gone down the
Oh,
embankment,
no.
and then because they were going at
I
such
messed
high
up
speed, they
somehow.
could have crashed their way into one of these forests and basically disappeared from view from the road. That in order to see this crash in the forest, you'd have to be basically in the forest. And so these 2 officers, they pulled over, they got out, and they began walking along the edge of the highway, staring into the forest, looking for a sign of a car wreck. And sure enough, after walking for a while, one of the officers spotted something deep in the woods that looked almost metallic,
Damn it.
plastic,
Well, how did I mess
whatever
up?
it wasn't supposed to be in the forest. And so the officers made their way into the tree line and began walking through all the trees. And as they got closer, they realized very clearly there was a car. There was a wreck in the forest. And so the 2 officers, they begin running towards the wreck. They're calling
Should I
for
get
backup on the
Fortnite?
radio.
Should
They
do.
get to this
You should
wreck
get
in the middle
Fortnite.
of the forest, and they're on the driver's
Fortnite
side.
doesn't
They
involve
look inside the
offing
car,
yourself.
And there's no driver in the driver's seat, but they looked through the car to the passenger side, and they saw the front passenger door was wide open, And on the ground, on the other side of the car, was very clearly a body.
Or you
And so
should
the two
get
police officers rushed around the
Valheim,
car to get a better look at the body.
or
And when they did,
what other
they
games
couldn't
are
believe
good?
what they were seeing. It didn't make any sense. Like, what was this?
Now,
Now, to understand why these police officers were so caught off guard by what they were seeing, we need to go back
I don't know what
5
other
months
games are
to
good.
July 16th, 2002. On that night, a 21-year-old
any
man named
survival
Christopher
game.
Brian Chandler finished up his beer
Alright, I
at
gotta
a
have to
pub
go
in
back and
West
see
London.
what the
And for
measurements are.
reference, where this pub was located was about 1 hour north of that stretch of the A3 highway in Surrey where the car was found in the woods. This night, Christopher had gone to this pub with a close friend of his. This was meant to be a fun night out.
3.
But, as Chris is finishing up this beer, he began to feel really antsy because it turned out Christopher was
8.
actually wanted by
It's an
police
8 by
in London for
8.
robbery.
Okay, it's 8.
And so he hated staying in one place
Ugh.
for too long. And so the only people who even knew where Christopher was the friend he was with at the bar, and then also Christopher's brother. He knew he was at this particular pub. And so finally, Christopher got so anxious about being in this pub for too long that he told the friend he was with that he just wanted to leave. And so he
Get
said
all of
goodnight
them.
to
Get
his
all the
friend.
survival
Friend
games.
stayed at the pub, and Christopher left, got in his car. and
You know what?
began
I was
driving
thinking
south.
about.
But Christopher never
We
arrived.
should get
at the place he
on
was trying to
Sons
go.
of the Forest.
He just sort of
soon.
disappeared.
It has a
nobody
bunch of
heard from him.
updates.
Christopher's
looking good.
brother eventually would report Christopher missing, but remember, the brother knows Christopher is wanted for robbery, and so Christopher suddenly going on the lam and just disappearing for a while was kind of par for the course, and so the brother really didn't think this was a big deal. And also, the police felt the same way because they know Christopher is trying to elude them, and so it makes sense he would be missing. And so as a result, nobody really followed up on Christopher's missing person report. Everybody just kind of moved on. That is, until 5 months later, when all those drivers began calling into the police in Surrey about seeing this totally reckless driver careening down the A3, who eventually crashed into a ditch. And then those two officers, they went out to that stretch of A3, and sure enough, it was Christopher's car, and the body on the ground was Christopher. However, there was a problem. When the two police officers walked up on Christopher's car and saw it for the first time, they were struck by how old it looked. But it didn't really register with them why that would matter. It just stood out to them that this is a really, really old and rusted up car. But when they went
¿Cuánto está?
around to look at the body on the ground, Christopher's body,
El
they
Sons of the
saw
Forest.
his body was actually mostly
Me imagino que hay un chorro de
skeletal,
cells por
which meant
Navidad y todo ese rollo,
Christopher
pero no sé
did
cuánto
not
está.
crash and die on this night, December 11th, 2002. Very likely, he crashed and died 5 months
1,
earlier,
2.
right around the time he disappeared.
Stop.
Now, the Surrey police, they say that this was all
1,
just one big
2,
coincidence. That the reckless driver that all these drivers were
5,
reporting that night on the
6,
A3 must have not crashed and actually
7.
just kind of got away.
It's 8.
Then just by
Why am I
coincidence, when
lagging
the
so
police
much?
were
What?
searching that area of the A3 for the reckless driver, they happened upon Chris and his car. But remember, several of the
1,
drivers who called
2,
in that night about
3,
seeing this reckless driver on the A3, they specifically said they
6,
saw the car
7,
veer off the
8.
embankment
It's
and
8.
crash down below near
So
the
I have it
road.
right.
Like, this is a
So then what?
serious crash. Someone needs to get out here with
What's
an
the
ambulance
deal?
because probably someone's hurt. And then when the police
1,
got out
it's
and
2, yeah, it's
searched
2.
the exact area where this crash supposedly happened, they find Chris's
1,
car
2,
that had all the
4.
hallmarks of a car that was driving recklessly on the A3 that veered off and crashed into the woods. I mean, they found Chris and his car because of these calls.
I don't get it.
But it could not have been Chris. But what other car could it have been? As of today, we do not have a good explanation for how this happened, and so it's been dubbed the A3 Ghost Crash. Well, we finally did it. I don't know if it was all the acid we poured into their contact lens solution, or if it was all the wild predators we released in their house, but somehow, some way, we killed the like button. And I know this because the ghost of the like button paid me, old sing-along, a visit last night. And after slapping me right in the anti-tragus and then pouring fox urine in my eyes, the ghost of the
Fox
like
urine.
button said, "Listen here, Mr. Ballin, if you want to bring me back to life and keep up with your antics, you need to bring me one piece of brand new Mr. Ballin merchandise." And I said, "Are you kidding me? Of course! We just launched a brand new merch line called Ballin Basics on shopmrballin.com right in time for the holidays. Ballin Basics has all your Mr. Ballin essentials like a sick hoodie, a great crew neck, Heck, there's even a special collector's item, the old Sigalang pin. And they're all numbered. There's only 500 of them, so get them while supplies last.
Oh, maybe it's a
So
different
again,
of these
go
ones.
to shopmrballin.com.
Skinnier one.
Ballin Basics
Yeah, maybe.
is live right now, so get your new merch, get your collector's item pin, old Sigalang. Meanwhile, I'll work
This guy
on
has the best
resurrecting the like
ads.
button so we can continue to find fulfillment in our lives by slipping some mayonnaise in the like button's peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. Happy holidays, everybody. Go to shopmrballin.com.
Mr. Ballin with shorts? Holy moly.
On the morning of August 2nd, 2017, two men sat together laughing inside of a bar in a tiny village in northern France. The men were named Lucien Perrault and Olivier Boudin, and even though there was a massive age difference between them, Lucien was 69 years old and Olivier was 38 years old, the two were totally inseparable, to the point where the people in the village referred to them as father and son. Lucien had spent his whole life working in manufacturing in a nearby city, but just 4 years earlier, he had finally retired and he had moved into a small home inside of this northern French village. But when he had first moved into this new home, he had been very lonely and sad. You know, Lucien was divorced, he struggled with alcohol, and he had had a really tough life, and he just wasn't doing well. But when he met Olivier, his whole life turned around. When the two met, Olivier also was kind of like a down on his luck guy. He was struggling with some health issues that made it hard to work, and so for years he had been bouncing between the nearby city and this village in northern France, looking for work somewhat unsuccessfully. And so when these two happened to connect, it's like they bonded over having kind of difficult lives. And for Lucien, what really mattered to him was Olivier, despite being so much younger than him, did not treat Lucien like he was this dried up, worthless old man. He treated Lucien like a peer. And so together, these two very unlikely best friends began kind of orchestrating their lives around the other. And before long, it was like their lives had all this new structure and routine and meaning to them, because again, the two men got to be together basically all day long. So, on this particular morning, as Olivier and Lucien were together at this bar, they began talking about what they wanted to do that night. And they settled on having a barbecue.
I don't know what is wrong with it.
Lucien would cook up some beef, and they would sit out on his back garden patio and just spend the night together. It sounded like a wonderful plan. And in fact, the bartender would say that when Olivier and Lucien finally left the bar that day, that he recalled overhearing them being so excited about this particular barbecue. And so that evening, Olivier and Lucien arrived at Lucien's house, and they went out to the back patio, where Lucien had already draped a nice tablecloth over this small round table. It was a red and white checkered patterned tablecloth.
Why?
And on this table was an open bottle of wine and some cheese and a baguette. And so Olivier, he sat down and began enjoying some wine and bread, and Lucien walked over to the grill and began cooking up the beef. Lucien had a neighbor. We're going to call her Marie because we don't actually know her real name. And Marie's second floor window overlooked Lucien's garden patio where the two men were having this cookout. And so that night, Marie did glance out and saw the two men kind of listening to music and goofing around, and she was used to them spending lots of time together, and she was also used to them staying up late at night. And so she figured, you know, tonight's going to be another one of those nights where these guys
this is not
late,
2, it's
wine,
3.
Celebrating whatever. You know, she was just gonna try to ignore the noise coming in and just let them do their thing. And so eventually, Marie would do that. She would go to bed to the sound of music coming from next door and the sound of men talking. And then the next morning, when Marie got up around 6 a.m., she looked out the window again, and frankly was not that shocked at what she saw. Lucien was still just sitting at the table, looking like he could be eating some bread or still drinking wine, and Olivier had clearly passed out on the ground. Now, Marie didn't judge. She knew these two liked to stay up late and drink and do stuff like this, and so she thought, you know what? None of my business. Then, at 9 a.m., so 3 hours after Marie had first woken up, she left her house to go to another neighbor's house to feed their chickens while they were away for the day. As she passed by Lucien's house, she glanced into his back garden patio, and she saw Lucien was still just sitting at the table, and Olivier was still passed out on the ground. It was like they hadn't moved for 3 hours. But again, Marie's thinking, none of my business. And so she just kept on going, went to her neighbor's house, and fed the chickens. But when Marie came back to her house 3 hours later, around noon, she looked again into Lucian's backyard, and she saw the two men still had not moved. Lucian is sitting at the table, and Olivier is laying on the ground. And suddenly Marie's thinking, wait a minute, the sun is high in the sky right now. These guys aren't moving. They're going to get heat stroke. We got to do something about this. And so she yelled out to Olivier and Lucian, but she got no response. And so Marie just walked into Lucian's backyard.
Yeah.
And as she got closer and closer to the two men, she realized
I'm
they
stupid.
were not moving at all. Like, they were not breathing. Something was horribly wrong here. And so Marie, she just turned and ran to another neighbor's house. She told them what was going on, and they got these big pots of water, and they ran back and doused Olivier and Lucian with water, trying to get them to snap out of their drunken stupor. But the two men did not move at all when the water hit them. Clearly, they were dead. The next day, the local prosecutor announced there was going to be an investigation into the two men's deaths, which were being classified as criminal acts. And the prosecutor also said that it seemed like Lucian and Olivier died at the same time, and so most likely this was either a double homicide or a murder-suicide, and the primary theory as to what killed the two men was poison put in their food. And so police sent off the canned beans the two men were eating to this institution in Paris to test it for something called botulism, which is a deadly toxin that will grow inside of canned foods, but it came back negative. And then also police sent off the rest of the food the two men were eating to various other laboratories to be tested for poisons. And again, all of it came back negative. There was nothing that the police could detect in any of the food they ate. And so police were kind of confused for a minute, but then the autopsies came back for Olivier and Lucian, and everything changed. Lucian and Olivier were not murdered. This was not a murder-suicide. They didn't die from botulism or from some poison in their food. They died because of a set of very particular circumstances. Both Lucian and Olivier suffered from non-fatal minor medical issues. Lucian had bad dental health and so was missing a couple of teeth, and Olivier was suffering from a heart condition called cardiomegaly, which means his heart was slightly enlarged and somewhat fragile. However, his condition was totally being monitored by doctors and was under control. But just for a second, on the night of August 2nd, 2017, when Lucian and Olivier were having that cookout in Lucian's backyard, their non-fatal minor medical issues suddenly became a really, really big deal. Lucian cooked up a big plate of beef rib. Now, beef rib can be difficult to chew even when you have all your teeth and take your time, but Lucian was missing teeth, and he loved this beef rib so much, he was wolfing it down really quickly, and so he wasn't chewing it enough, and at some point, he swallowed a particularly big unchewed bite, and he began to choke.
That'll do it,
When
no?
that happened, his best buddy, Olivier, sitting across from him, he stood up to try to help his friend, who's basically dying right in front of him, and the stress of this moment caused his heart to seize up, his heart, which is already enlarged and
No shot.
fragile,
Oh my god,
had a
does it
heart
fit?
attack and died. And then Lucian,
Uh-huh.
who now has no one to help him, continued to sit at the table trying to get this beef out of his throat, but he couldn't, and he eventually asphyxiated.
That's
and
fucking
died as
unlucky.
well, hunched over at the table.
Jesus.
A little after 7 a.m. on the morning of April 15th, 2007, three men launched a 35-foot white catamaran called the Cas-2 from a marina in northeastern Australia, kicking off what was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime. The captain of the Cas-2 was 56-year-old Des Batten, and for months
Unlucky.
he'd been training for this trip. And the two friends that Des was bringing with him on this trip were Jim Tunstead, who was 63 years old, and Jim's brother, Peter Tunstead, who was 69 years old. All three of the men had spent a lot of time plotting their actual course they'd be going on, which was from this marina on the northeastern side of Australia, up and around the north side, and then down the western coast to Perth, which was their final destination and where all three men lived. In total, this trip was supposed to take 8 weeks, and all three men were absolutely giddy with excitement at the prospect of spending an entire 2 months basically just drinking beers and fishing. Now, Des, Jim, and Peter were not the types to blow off responsibility to go party. I mean, they were devoted family men. All of them had been married for 30 plus years. Des had 2 kids, Jim had 4 kids, and Peter had 5 kids. But they were all either retired or nearing retirement, and this trip was going to be kind of a way to celebrate the end of an era. And while all 3 of them had gone on other big sailing trips, this one easily was the biggest one in terms of the distance they were covering and how much prep went into it and how expensive it was. I mean, this was like 10x the scope and scale of any other sailing trip they had done. And so, on April 15th, 2007, shortly after the 3 men had launched their boat and kicked off this big trip, Peter's wife would call him just to see how it was going. And she would say, Peter was in great spirits, and she could hear the other 2 men laughing in the background, and it sounded like they were about to start fishing and maybe have a couple of beers. And so it seemed very much to Peter's wife like this trip was going as well as it could be so far. And so eventually, Peter told his wife that he had to go, he told her he loved her, and then they hung up. Now, Des, who was the captain of the Kaz 2, was adamant about safety being the top concern for this trip. Even though all 3 men were relatively healthy and had a lot of sailing experience, and even though Des was a member of a volunteer marine rescue group, and so literally could be called on to go perform rescues at sea, despite all this experience and know-how, before they kicked off this trip, Des made Jim and Peter go through all these man overboard drills on the Kaz 2 to make sure they knew how to do it, if for some reason, an emergency arose out at sea. And so the men got really comfortable using all the life-saving equipment and going over all the procedures. And then also, when they charted their course, Des stressed that at no point should they be sailing into open water. They needed to stay close to shore the whole time just because it was safer. And so, when Jim began filming a video around 10 a.m. on the day they set sail for this trip, you can clearly see the shore in the background of this video, so they're following the course they had planned. But a couple of hours after Jim had shot that video on the day they left, a woman named Isabel Wheeler, who did not know Des, Jim, or Peter and had never seen the Kaz 2 before, she was fishing in an area called Champagne Bay when she looked out into the water and she saw the Kaz 2, a white 35-foot catamaran, sailing east to west across the horizon. And then at some point, as Isabel was watching this boat, which really meant nothing to her, she just happened to be watching it, she saw it make a quick 90-degree turn and began sailing out towards the open ocean away from the coastline. Now, remember, Isabel knows nothing of this boat or its occupants, and so has no idea that Des, Peter, and Jim had been so clear about at no point will we sail into the open ocean. It's too dangerous. Stay close to shore. She didn't know that. And so she just saw a ship turning and sailing out to the open water, and she thought, okay, whatever. So she didn't go and report what she saw. It was only later on, when details emerged about what happened on the Kaz 2, that she would...
Stop, buddy. Hey, how are they getting in?
The next day...
Leave me alone. Leave me alone, man.
People would spot the Kaz 2. These were 2 men who also did not know Des, Peter, Jim. They didn't know Kaz 2. They didn't know Isabel. In fact, these 2 men didn't know each other. But independently, on this day, they looked out near Champagne Bay, and they saw the Kaz 2 sailing east to west in the exact same spot that Isabel had seen it the day before. Now, remember, the Kaz 2 was traveling from that marina on the northeast side of Australia all the way around to Perth.
Get away from me, bro.
It was
Get away
a
from me.
point A to point B trip. There was no reason the Kaz 2 would ever double back and be in the same place 24 hours later. But here we were, 24 hours later, and 2 more people are seeing the Kaz 2 in the same place that Isabel had seen it. And so that made no sense. But again, these 2 men who saw the Kaz 2,
I think nothing can get in now.
And thought nothing of it, because they don't know anything about this boat. It wasn't until later that they eventually came forward with what they saw. Then, one more day after that, on April 17th, there were these fishermen that were out in their boats a little farther north of Champagne Bay, where Isabel and the 2 other men had seen the Kaz 2 on consecutive days. And these fishermen, they spotted the Kaz 2. And again, these fishermen do not know the Kaz 2. They don't know its occupants. They're just seeing the ship. Except this time, the fishermen, when they saw the Kaz 2, they thought something was wrong, because they saw the Kaz 2 from a distance navigating its way fairly close to shore in an area that these fishermen knew was full of coral reefs. It's a very dangerous area to be piloting any ship. In addition, the sail of the Kaz-2 was totally ripped to shreds. And so the fishermen, they're looking at the ship, wondering what they're doing, but the pilot of the ship looked so in control as he's navigating his way through the coral reefs that the fishermen thought, okay, he knows what he's doing, so, leave him alone. But again, later on, they would report what they saw. It wasn't until the next day, April 18th, so 3 days after Des, Peter, and Jim had set sail, that anybody realized there was an issue with the crew of the Kaz-2. Because on April 18th, a Coast Watch surveillance helicopter was flying over the Great Barrier Reef, and they looked down and they saw the Kaz-2 with its badly damaged sails, piloting all around this very dangerous part of the water to be piloting. And so the crew on board the helicopter attempted to radio down to the Kaz-2 to see if they were okay, but no one from the Kaz-2 called back to the helicopter. And so as they're waiting for a response from the Kaz-2, the helicopter crew is watching the pilot of the Kaz-2 clearly, navigating the boat in between coral reefs. And it seemed like, despite the damage to the sails, he knew what he was doing. And so to the crew on the helicopter, this didn't really look like an emergency, but it seemed like something worth flagging. And so they called the Marine police and said, hey, we have this ship here that's not responding. We think they're okay, but you might want to come take a look. And so the Marine police, they would come out to the area where the helicopter had said they had seen the Kaz-2, and when they got there, the Kaz-2 was gone. At this point, the Marine police got some information about the boat, Kaz-2, and discovered who owned the boat and who was on this trip, so Des, Peter, and Jim, and the police would get in touch with all of their families, and they would all tell police that besides Peter's wife, who talked to Peter on that morning they left, no one had heard from any of the men. They had gone totally silent since that first day. And so when police heard this, they knew this had to be some kind of emergency, and so a search was launched to find the Kaz-2. And 48 hours later, a rescue helicopter that was part of the search was about 80 or so miles off the northeastern coast of Australia when they looked down and they spotted the Kaz-2. And it still had all torn up sails, and it was kind of spinning listlessly in the water. And from the helicopter, they couldn't see anybody on board the ship. It was totally vacant on the deck. Now, at this point, authorities really have no idea what's going on with this boat or its occupants. It was possible that maybe they had been hijacked, and so Des, Peter, and Jim could be held hostage down below, along with the people that took them hostage. Or maybe the boat just got stolen, and Des, Peter, and Jim are not on this boat. It looks ugly.
There's a one block gap.
Again, they're down below, hidden from view. So authorities, they don't know, but they decided to take a risk and just send somebody down to get on that boat and just see what was going on. So a rescue officer on board the rescue helicopter named Corey Benson was lowered by a rope where he was dropped into the water, and then Corey swam by himself over to the Kaz-2, and he climbed up the side of the boat, and he stepped onto the deck, and right away he noticed it was kind of like eerily quiet on board the boat. There was nobody he could see, and there was no sign of any disturbance, minus the sails of the ship being all tattered. And for a second, Corey thought about maybe calling out for Des, Peter, and Jim to see if they were down below and could come up and solve this mystery. But then he also worried that if he called out, there could be some bad people on board this boat, and he didn't want to draw their attention. And so Corey was quiet and just began walking towards the front of the boat. And as he did, he began to notice signs that people must have recently been on board this boat doing normal things. Like, for example, there was a fishing rod that was cast out into the water that was anchored to a post on the side of the boat that looked like it had just been operated minutes ago. There was a blue mug of coffee that was just sitting on a table that looked like maybe someone had been drinking from it recently. There was a neatly folded t-shirt on the chair with a set of glasses on them. I mean, there was just all these kind of tells that this was a boat that was being used recently. And when Corey actually got to the front of the boat where the captain would stand, he saw the engine was actually still on. It was idling. And so Corey turned it off. Now, at this point, Corey knew his next step was going down the stairs and opening up the door that led into the cabin down below to see if Des, Peter, and Jim were down there. But he also knew when he went down there, despite there being backup up in the helicopter and more people making their way out here, Corey would be all alone if there were criminals or bad people down there. But this was his job. And so after taking a deep breath, he turned and walked down the few steps, and he got to the door that led to the cabin. He grabbed the handle and he opened it up. And the room he was walking into was kind of like a half living room, half kitchen area. And he saw there was this table, and on it was a newspaper that was dated April 15th, so the day the Cavs set sail. And then on the wall behind the newspaper was a calendar where days had been marked off all the way through April 14th. April 15th was not marked off. But also nearby on a table was a computer that was still plugged in and on and looked very much like someone had just been using it. And also there were plates of food that
Why not, bro?
old, that also seemed like people must have just been eating from them. And then also Corey could see past this common area into the bedroom, and very obviously the bunks inside of there had been slept in. And so basically everything seemed like it was where it should be. There was just one problem. Des, Peter, and Jim were not on this ship. There was no sign of where they were. They were just gone. And there was nobody else on board the ship. It was just completely abandoned with no sign of what happened. Des, Jim, and Peter were never found. And so we have no idea what actually happened to them. Nor do we have any idea why they were seen by Isabel and the two men and the fishermen doing all these weird things, like randomly piloting out towards open water, which totally went against their plan, which was stay close to shore, be safe. Or, why on that second day they were seen in the same spot near Champagne Bay, indicating they had doubled back after going towards open water. That went against their plan, which was point A to point B. Why are they doubling back around? And so, unfortunately, this whole thing is just one big mystery that has yet to be solved. Since you made it to the end of this video, I think it's safe to assume that you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious. And so if that's true, this is your reminder that we actually have a brand new weekly show, a podcast, that's free and available on every platform right now.
Why doesn't it let
Mr.
me?
Ballen's Medical Mysteries, and it's definitely a strange, dark, and mysterious show like you've come to expect, but obviously the focus of the show is medical mysteries. From bizarre, unheard of diseases to miraculous recoveries, strange medical mishaps,
Such a stressful
unexplained
build.
deaths, and all of them have big plot twists at the end. The first 8 episodes of Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries are out right now on every platform, and this Tuesday coming up, another 8 episodes are going to be released on Amazon Music. Or if you listen on other podcast platforms like Apple or Spotify or whatever, you will continue to get one new episode of Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries every Tuesday. And if all this was not enough to convince you to at least go check out Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, then hopefully this sneak peek of episode number 9, called Sleep
get a
Addict,
sneak
releasing this
peek?
Tuesday, will push you over
Holy.
the edge. After you listen to the sneak peek, be sure to go follow and turn on all notifications for Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries. Here is the sneak peek of episode number 9, Sleep Addict. On the morning of July 30th, 1976, a young doctor examined an elderly veteran at Bloomsburg Hospital in Pennsylvania, desperately looking for a way to keep this man alive. His lungs were filling up with fluid, but no matter how many times the doctor drained them, the fluid just kept coming back. The man suddenly began to spasm in his bed, coughing up a bloody pink froth. Dr. Ernest Campbell tried to stay calm, but he knew he was running out of options. He'd seen people die from respiratory failure before, but this had progressed faster and more suddenly than anything he'd ever experienced. And this patient was only one of several in the hospital with the same disturbing symptoms. In fact, Dr. Campbell had heard about similar cases appearing across the entire state, and so he was terrified that this was the onset of a deadly epidemic. And if it was, there might be no way to stop it. Thank you for listening. Now go check out
I have no
Mr.
idea
Ballen's
how
Medical
I did this.
Mysteries
What the hell?
wherever you get your podcasts. It's free, new episodes every week. So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's stories, be sure to check out our podcast called the Mr. Ballen Podcast, which has hundreds more stories just like these, but many of them are only available on the podcast. Again, it's called the Mr. Ballen Podcast, and it's available on Amazon Music. Today, we're going to look at 3 stories that sound totally made up, but they are all true. But before we get into those stories, if
That
you're
looks
a fan of
exactly how I
Strange
have it over
Dark
there, not gonna lie.
Mysterious delivered in story format, and you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, the next time you're over the Like Button's house, sneak into their closet and replace all of their shoe insoles with pudding skins. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the morning of December 21st, 1980, a woman in her 40s walked into a jail cell in Los Angeles, California. Now, in this jail cell already was another inmate. Her name was Etta Louise Smith. She was 32 years old, and at the time, she was laying on one of the benches inside of this cell. Etta had actually been in jail for 4 days leading up to this moment. The police were sure Etta had something to do with the savage murder of a nurse in the area, but they really didn't understand what role she had played. In fact, virtually everything about Etta was very confusing to police. And Etta herself was not really doing herself any favors because she wasn't really explaining how she had the information that she had. Now, Etta had already gone through a 10-hour-long interrogation, which led police nowhere. She had undergone a polygraph test, which didn't lead to any new answers. And she had also undergone a thorough strip search. She had been kept without food for 24 hours at one point. She had been left in this cold jail cell without shoes for 4 days. But she just wouldn't crack. She would not confess to playing a role in this murder. And so this was why police on this day had decided to go another route to get information out of Etta. That woman in her 40s who had just walked into Etta's jail cell was pretending to be an inmate, but in reality, she was an undercover cop. And her job was to go into this jail cell, befriend Etta, win her trust, and see if maybe then Etta would begin revealing information about what she had done. And so after this undercover cop walked into the jail cell, the jailer shut the door behind them, closing in the undercover cop and Etta. And at this point, Etta was woken up by the noise, and she sat up on her bench, and she looked over at the undercover cop. And the cop,
Okay, I don't know
she
why
was
that worked.
immediately struck by Etta's appearance. Etta did not look like her. She was this little, slight, totally unthreatening person who really just looked like a suburban mom who maybe had a white-collar job. But the undercover cop also knew that appearing to be totally harmless was a great cover for being a murderer, and so this could all totally be an act. And also, to this undercover cop, it just seemed like Etta was way too calm and collected given her circumstances. She is effectively wanted for murder, and the police are putting so much pressure on her to get her to speak about it, and she's just laying down sleeping in her cell, making no big deal about it. But the undercover cop maintained a very neutral persona, and she sat down, and at some point she asked Etta, hey, what are you in here for? And Etta, she kind of just looked down and smiled for a second.
Yeah, that looks good enough.
Then when she looked back up at the undercover cop, she said, you're never going to believe me. The undercover cop at this said, oh, come on, how bad could it be? Tell me what's going on here. Why are you in here? And it was at this point that Etta would say something that nearly caused the cop to break character. Because Etta, she would say, well, I'm pretty sure this is going to be a movie. Now, the undercover police officer tried to be as neutral as possible as she's
I'm
hearing
gonna be a
this.
movie star.
But in her mind, she's like, okay, well, I clearly just discovered Etta's motive for being involved in this murder. Etta wants to be famous. She wants this made into a movie where she's the star. At the same time this conversation was happening, in an office within the jailhouse, a police captain was listening in on the conversation between Etta and this undercover cop. And when he listened to Etta talk about wanting to turn her story into a movie, he just shook his head in disgust because Etta had just brought police to the location of the body of 31-year-old Melanie Uribe, a local nurse who was robbed and savagely beaten to death and then dumped in a canyon behind a bush. And now here Etta was talking about how she could get publicity around this terrible, horrible crime. It just did not sit right with the captain. And so as the captain was sitting there kind of watching this conversation transpire between the undercover cop and Etta, the captain was beginning to form a theory of what actually happened to Melanie Uribe and how Etta played a role in her murder. His theory went like this. 6 days earlier, the victim, Melanie Uribe, had left for her shift at the hospital in Burbank, California, which is a suburb of Los Angeles, but she had never arrived for her shift. And so when her colleagues had noticed her absence, eventually the police were called and a search was launched to find her. But after 48 hours, the police had not found Melanie and there were no signs as to what happened to her. She had just vanished. And it was at that point, 2 days after Melanie had gone missing, that Etta just showed up at the police station and said she knew where Melanie was. And so the detective who was talking to Etta at the time when she came in and said this, he brought out a map and he said, okay, point to where she is. And Etta had immediately pointed to this area on the map called Lopez Canyon, which was about 25 miles away from Los Angeles. And she would tell the detective that, yeah, Melanie is somewhere right in there. When the detective asked Etta, how do you know this? Etta would say she just knew. And then when the detective followed up and said, Etta, this is pretty incriminating that you're telling me you know where someone's body is. What's motivating you to come and say this to me? And Etta would say that her conscience was weighing on her terribly, and she just had to go to police. Now, the detective who talked to Etta when she first came into the police station really didn't know what to make of Etta, because she looked so unthreatening, and what she was saying, she was saying with a lot of confidence, and it seemed like she was really eager to help the investigation versus just clearing her conscience, which is kind of what she said she was doing. And when the detective looked into who Etta was, he discovered that she had a great job. She worked at an aerospace company in Burbank, California, and she even had governmental clearance. And so this woman clearly has been vetted by the government and by high-level companies, and she's passed the tests. But at the same time, the detective knew there was no good reason for why Etta would have this information, the location of a dead body. I mean, either she's just wrong and there is no body there, or if the body's there, the most likely scenario is that Etta was involved in killing this person or disposing of their body, or maybe both. So the detective said to Etta, hey, come back tomorrow and we'll take a police helicopter, we'll fly out over that canyon, and we'll see if we can find Melanie's body together. And so Etta said, okay, sounds good. She turned and she left. But then just an hour later, Etta came back into the police station with her 2 young kids in the car, and she would tell that detective that she actually just drove out with her kids to that canyon and had found Melanie's body. In fact, she told the detective that her 7-year-old child, who was in the car right now, had been the one to actually find Melanie's body. The detective could not believe this woman, 1, had gone out by herself to do this, but 2, had brought along her kids as well? Like, what's going on with this person? But regardless of how weird this was, the detective immediately rounded up some backup, and with Etta's help, they went out to a particular spot in this canyon, and sure enough, when they got out there, right in the spot where Etta said it would be, was Melanie's badly beaten body. And so it was at this point that the police captain had grabbed Etta and said, you're under arrest, I'm putting you in a cell because there's no way you could have known about this unless you were somehow involved. The captain thought by putting Etta in jail for a couple of days, she'd get scared and start talking. But 4 days had gone by and Etta had not cracked. She had not given up anything beyond telling the undercover police officer that she thought her story that was kind of still developing would likely be turned into a movie. And so the captain really didn't know what to do because at this point, Etta had not actually committed a crime. It was not a crime to find a dead person's body and report it to the police. And there was no evidence that actually tied Etta to the murder. All the police had was the fact that Etta came to them and told them that she knew where the body was, and then they actually found the body. But that's all they had. But the police captain would catch a break on that 4th day because he would receive a phone call that would totally change everything about this case. It would turn out on December 17th, 1983, so the same day that Etta would go
that's going to be an ugly roof.
That's fine. Report that she knew where Melanie Uribe's body was. Well, on that day, Etta was at work, listening to the radio and filing some paperwork. And as Etta listened to the radio, the local newscaster was talking about Melanie Uribe and how she was missing. And the newscaster talked about how police had found her truck and it was parked on this dead-end street, and that police were searching nearby residences to see if maybe they knew what happened to Melanie. But as of right now, there really was no new leads. They did not know where Melanie was. And it was right around this point that Etta's listening to the news about Melanie that Etta heard a voice in the room she was in. And the voice said very clearly to Etta, she's not in one of those houses. And Etta immediately, when she heard it, she turned around, wondering who the heck was in here, who's talking to her, but there was nobody else in the room. And then it was like immediately there were these flashes of images in Etta's brain that she had no idea what they meant, but it was a succession of a dirt road, and then a bush, and then something white, a nurse's shoe. And Etta very clearly saw these three images. And it was right then that Etta thought, oh my God, I know where Melanie Uribe is. And so she sat there wondering what to do, and then finally thought, I have to go to police, as crazy as this sounds. And so she hopped in the car, and she drove to the police station, and she said, I don't know how, but I do know Melanie Uribe is right there in that canyon. But when the police had said, come back tomorrow and we'll go out and look for her, Etta just couldn't wait. And so she had gone with her kids, driven out to the canyon that she had seen in her mind. And sure enough, when she got out there, she found the dirt road that she had seen. Then she found the bush that she had seen. And then with the help of her kids, they found the white nurse's shoe. And it was right near Melanie's body. Which
So
meant
why
that
doesn't
voice
it-
that Etta heard and the vision she had all been real. The phone call that the police captain received on the fourth day that Etta was sitting in jail and talking to the undercover cop, the phone call that changed the whole case. Well,
Jesus,
the
this
phone call was from another police
game is
officer
so laggy.
saying they had just arrested 3 men who were caught bragging about beating and killing Melanie Uribe, and they had confessed, and they were now being held in jail.
All
And so
right.
clearly, Etta did not commit this murder, and so even though it made no sense that she just knew where this body was, the police had to release Etta the same day, so she was released, and then ultimately the 3 men who confessed to killing Melanie Uribe, they would be found guilty, and they would each be sentenced to life in prison. 6 years later, Etta would sue the police department, and she would win the lawsuit because the jury on that case absolutely believed that Etta really did have a psychic vision
Okay.
that led to the discovery
Nah,
of
she's
Melanie's
psychic,
body.
bro.
Etta would
You
never
fucked
go
up.
on to make a movie about her story. And in fact, when she was asked later on about why she said that during her conversations with that undercover cop, Etta would clarify that she didn't say that she wanted to make a movie, but rather she said to the undercover cop something to the effect of, it feels like I'm living out a bad movie. And so that was kind of misconstrued by police into her saying, I want to make a movie about this. She didn't and has never made a movie, and in no way has sought out any fame or recognition for what happened.
That movie line really fucked her up.
Today's video was
Oh,
sponsored
shit.
by SoFi. Shortly after we
Lovely.
left the military in
Oh, that's
2017, my
yes.
family and I decided we wanted to move. And so we went house hunting and found the one we wanted and moved to purchase it. Now, we had bought one other house before, but we used what's called the VA loan, which is a low-interest loan for military members.
This
And
game's
for
so
a variety
laggy,
of
bro.
reasons, we were not able
It's
to
so
use
laggy.
the VA loan to buy this new house. And so we had to go the traditional financing route. And my goodness, was going through that
Stop throwing shit at me,
process
bro.
totally overwhelming
rude.
and stressful.
It's
But
rude.
if I had known about
Stop
SoFi
it.
at the time I was doing this, the whole thing would have been a breeze. SoFi is the ultimate finance app that helps you bank, borrow, and invest all in one place. But what really stands out to me about SoFi are their incredible home
For
mortgage
real,
loan
straight up, so
options for
rude.
military
Oh
veterans.
my
SoFi is
god.
actually a veteran-led company, which is definitely part of the reason why they care so much about supporting military veterans and active duty military members on their journey towards realizing their financial ambitions, which includes homeownership.
Oh,
Veterans who use SoFi can qualify for perks like lower interest
That
rates, lower
sucks.
closing costs, no mortgage insurance, and also potentially no down payment requirement. So think
This
about
game's so
joining
garble.
the over 130,000 homeowners who SoFi has helped get their home loans. Also, SoFi is doing a giveaway where you can have a chance to win up to $50,000 that will go towards helping a veteran pay their rent or mortgage for 1 year. To enter, click the link in the description below or go to sofi.com/winva and then just follow all the on-screen instructions to view your VA home loan mortgage rate. Thank you, SoFi. Back to the stories. On the night of November 7th, 1860, a 51-year-old American politician walked inside of his modest two-story home in Springfield, Illinois. This politician was totally exhausted, but he was also really happy because in his hand he had a telegram that confirmed he had won an election that he had worked so hard for and he wasn't sure he was going to get. And so earlier that night, this politician had been out basically partying and celebrating this huge victory. But now he was totally beat and ready for bed. Once the politician was inside his house, he picked up an oil lamp to light the way, and he walked through his house to his study, where he put
Well, I
the
can't
lamp
see
down
where I'm
on his
putting it
desk.
down.
He put the telegram saying he had won this election next to the lamp, and then the politician just collapsed into his sofa to fall asleep. But before he closed his eyes, this politician looked over at a mirror on the wall, and what he saw in the mirror made him gasp, and he sat upright and looked at it like he couldn't believe what
How
he
the
had
fuck
seen.
did this fuck
In
up
this
so
mirror,
bad?
this politician was seeing his own face reflected as it should be, but then next to it was another face, and it was not his. It kind of looked like him, but it actually looked more like a corpse, like a dead person was looking out at him from this mirror. And so the politician, he stood up and began walking over to the mirror to get a closer look. But as he got closer, the dead person's face disappeared, and all was left was his own reflection. And so he's like, okay, I must have been dreaming that, that can't have been real. And so feeling very unsettled, this politician just went back over to the couch, and he laid back down thinking, okay, just forget about that, go to sleep. But again, he glanced over at the mirror, and now that he was laying down again, he saw the two faces again, his own and this dead person's face. And at this point, he stood up and rushed out of the room into his bedroom where his wife was. Now, his wife was a very devoted spiritualist, and so the politician thought maybe he could tell her about what he saw in the mirror, and she could interpret it and tell him what it meant. And so he sat down and he told his wife about what he had just seen, and she would sit there for a minute pondering what her husband had just said. And then her expression on her face just totally changed. She went from intrigued to very upset, and in a quivering voice, she would tell her husband that what this meant was he would serve honorably in the office that he had just been elected to for one term, he would get reelected, but he would not survive the second term. Now, when the politician heard this, he immediately rejected it, and he said to his wife, there's no way that's true. I probably didn't even see a face in the mirror. I'm probably just so tired, I imagined what I saw, so let's just forget about it. But his wife was not consoled, and she fell into his arms sobbing as if he had just been diagnosed with some fatal illness. And over the next several days and weeks and months, this politician's wife continued to be so upset about this potential death omen that the politician had apparently had, even though, again, the politician is constantly telling his wife, come on, there's no way that's actually going to happen. And sure enough, over time, the politician's wife did sort of stop being so scared all the time that her husband was going to die, and the politician himself, he just kind of forgot about what he had seen in the mirror that night. So he would go on to serve his first term in this elected office. He would be reelected for a second term. And then during his second term, on April 14th, 1865, this politician and his wife were out at a play in Washington, D.C., and during the last act of the play,
I think now it's fixed.
John Wilkes Booth famously snuck up behind Abraham Lincoln, who was this elected politician. He was the president of the United States in his second term. John Wilkes Booth shot Abraham Lincoln in the back of the head, killing him. And so Abraham Lincoln would indeed not survive his second term, just like the mirror death omen had predicted.
That happened to the homie Abe? Nah.
On April 1st, 1984, a 28-year-old man named James Sevigny opened his eyes and looked down and saw his whole body was covered in snow, and a lot of that snow had turned red from what looked like blood. James tried to take a breath in, but as soon as he did, his chest exploded in pain.
It looks
Then
so
James
bad.
began moving his tongue around in his mouth, and he realized there was this weird substance in his mouth, and there were all these sharp objects in his mouth. And so when he spit, he realized what it was. It was blood and shattered teeth. James began to panic and tried to lift up one of his arms, but it wouldn't move. And then when he tried to move his other arm, it did move, but that little movement hurt so bad he began crying in pain. So James is dealing with this blinding full body pain that he has no idea what it came from. He's looking around and he can barely understand where he is or what happened. But then James looked up kind of right behind him and he saw this enormous snow-covered mountain. Now, James had no idea what mountain this was, but in his head, he thought, I must have attempted to climb that mountain. James was a self-described
How did I fuck up the
climbing
roof?
This really just meant he lived out of his car
Oh
most of the
my
time
God.
and traveled all around the world, seeking out the most dangerous mountains in the world for him to climb. And so as James was racking his brain, trying to remember what happened, suddenly it all just came flooding back. He remembered he was here in the Canadian Rockies with his best friend, Richard Whitmore, And the two of them had attempted to climb this particular mountain. It was an 11,000-foot tall mountain called Mount Deltaform. And James remembered that as they were making their way up this mountain, they were hit by an avalanche. Now, James didn't really remember what happened once the avalanche hit them, but it would turn out he had fallen, along with his friend Richard, about 140 stories as this avalanche carried them down the mountain. For reference, that's taller than the Empire State Building, so this is a massive fall. And so as James is remembering that avalanche, he began looking around frantically for his friend Richard, hoping that maybe he was okay and nearby, and they could work together to get out of this situation. And sure enough, at some point, James looked over and he saw there was a crumpled figure kind of lying in the snow that obviously was another person. And so James instinctively tried to sit up to go over to his friend, but as soon as he attempted to do that, he felt the blinding pain in his body. I mean, he is totally wrecked here, and he couldn't stand up. But James really wanted to go see his friend, so he kind of rolled over, and through the pain, using his one good arm, he crawled his way over to Richard. And for a second, he thought maybe his friend was alive, that he too had survived this epic fall. But as he looked down at Richard, he could see his chest was not moving, and his neck was twisted really badly, and so was his back. And so James knew his friend, Richard, was dead. And so James just collapsed into the snow, feeling unbelievable anguish and sadness and fear. I mean, this is the only other person out here. They are nowhere near civilization, and it's going to be at least 4 days before anybody even notices that they aren't back yet, because that was when James and Richard were supposed to be home. And now James is thinking, like, I can't even stand up. I can barely breathe. I'm so badly hurt. What am I going to do? And pretty quickly, James adopted the mindset of, unfortunately, you're going to die here. And this was something James had always thought would happen to him eventually, that a mountain would end up killing him. And here he was realizing that, yep, that's exactly what's about to happen. I'm going to die out here. And so James just kind of lay there, resigned to his fate, literally waiting to die. And after about 20 minutes, when his body began to go numb and he was starting to enter into hypothermia, James heard a voice from behind him. It was this woman who walked right up to him, and she said, "You can't give up. You have to try." And James, even though he was totally caught off guard that there was another person out here, there was something so calming about this woman and the way she was talking to him that without any hesitation, it was like James's whole mindset about this situation completely changed. Suddenly, he was not ready to give up and die. But now, because of this woman, he was going to fight to survive. And so, after kind of moving around and looking back towards this woman, she would say to him, "Put your coat on." And so James, despite the excruciating pain, used his one arm that still worked and kind of propped himself up. And then he pulled his coat out of his pack, which was lying near him. And very painfully, he slipped his coat over his broken and damaged arms. And then once the coat was on him, the woman said to James, "Now take a sip of water." And so James, without any hesitation, he reached over and grabbed his water. He unscrewed the top and took a sip, despite how painful it was to sip, even though the water stung his totally shattered mouth. And then after James put the water down, the woman very calmly told him, "Okay, now disconnect yourself from Richard's body and then use the tree right here to pull yourself up." And so he untied from Richard, and then using his one good arm, he grabbed the tree and he managed to hoist himself up onto his totally destroyed legs. And he couldn't believe he was even standing at this point, but here he was, up on his feet. And then the woman said, "Okay, it's time to move." And so James began walking away from the mountain, and this woman just followed along behind him. And for a long time, he trudged through this knee-high snow, barely able to take a step without this blinding pain coursing through his body. But every time he began to stumble or slow down or seemed like he was going to give up, the woman would very calmly urge him to keep going, keep moving. And finally, after about 4 hours of this horribly painful trek James was on, he came upon the camp that he and his friend Richard had built before coming over to this mountain to begin this climb. And so James quickly began moving towards his tent that was still pitched, that he knew inside had a warm sleeping bag and some water and food. And so as he made his way towards the tent, he stopped himself and he turned around to talk to his guide, to thank her for pushing him onward. But when he turned, there was no one there. And when he looked at the ground, there was only one set of bloody footprints that were his, leading all the way back to where he had fallen. This guide, this woman, she didn't exist. James was totally unsettled by this and really didn't know what to do about it, but he knew right now the priority was just to survive. And so he made his way over to his tent and he attempted to get inside of it, but his hands were so cold and so badly beaten up that he couldn't use the zipper. He couldn't even get it open. And then finally, when he managed to use a tool to get it open, he couldn't open up his sleeping bag. It was like his body was shutting down. And so we thought, okay, I'll make a fire, and that will be enough to keep me warm. But again, it's like his body was failing him, and he couldn't do it. He couldn't start the fire. And so right as James is realizing that, despite making it to this campsite, he may not be able to survive because he can't use the campsite, he began to hear voices. Right away, James is worried that the voices he's hearing don't really exist, like this woman he had seen. But sure enough, just a second later, 3 skiers came around the corner and they saw James. And amazingly, one of them was a very experienced mountain guide, and another one of them was a nurse. And so right away, when they saw James, they saw he was dying. The nurse rushed over, she made a fire for him, she got him comfortable, she put on warm clothes, and the mountain guide, he took off to go get help. And sure enough, a couple hours later, a helicopter arrived and they airlifted James out, and he would make a full recovery. However, it would take James years before he finally opened up about this mysterious vanishing woman who literally saved his life. Without her talking to him and urging him to go, he would have laid there next to his friend and died. But James, he was afraid to bring up that he had seen this woman in fear that people would think he was crazy. But when he finally brought it up, he would quickly learn that he was far from the first person to experience this phenomenon of having this invisible person help you. In fact, this phenomenon is common enough that it has its own name. It's called the third man effect. The third man refers to this mysterious vanishing person that steps in and helps people survive who have just undergone some horribly traumatic event. An example of somebody else who has experienced the third man effect was the very last person to escape the Second World Trade Center tower on September 11th, 2001 in New York City during the terrorist attacks. He was able to get out right before it collapsed because a mysterious vanishing voice told him exactly which direction to go until he escaped. And so, whether the third man effect is actually supernatural or just a trick of survivor psychology, we don't know. James, who is both an atheist and a scientist, says he does not believe that this woman who saved him was an angel or connected to religion in any way. Instead, he just said, it was a presence that I needed at the time that saved my life, but that is the extent of my understanding. There are many totally terrifying stories that have come from Native American folklore, but none are quite as unsettling as the story of the Wendigo. According to the Ojibwe people, the Wendigo is this huge 12-foot tall, slightly emaciated, gray-looking humanoid creature that's constantly roaming the earth searching for food because it's always hungry. And what does it eat? People. The Wendigo will be featured on the very first episode of our brand new, incredible podcast from Ballin Studios called Run Fool. Run Fool comes directly from the mind of the horror storytelling icon, Rodney Barnes. Rodney is an award-winning writer and producer who has helped define the horror genre in film, TV, and even in comic books. And now, I'm certain he's going to help redefine the horror genre in podcasting. To hear the story of the Wendigo, go run to wherever you get your podcasts, look up Run Fool, and make sure you karate chop that follow button. Episodes 1 and 2 of Run Fool are available right now wherever you get your podcasts. And remember, every week, Rodney will drop a brand new scary story. So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's stories, be sure to check out our podcast called the Mr. Ballin Podcast, which has hundreds more stories just like these available to listen to right now, but many of those stories are only available on the podcast. Again, it's called the Mr. Ballin Podcast, and it's available on Amazon Music. Today, we're going to look at 3 medical mysteries, with each story being more unbelievable than the last. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, the next time you're visiting the like button at their house, be sure you rub poison ivy all over their toilet paper. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On June 14th, 2011, 42-year-old Ellie Lobel stepped unsteadily outside of her house in Wildomar, California, and immediately she had to lean on her round-the-clock caretaker for support. This mother of three had just moved to this rural part of California so she could die in peace. For the last 15 years, Ellie had been battling Lyme disease, which is a chronic and debilitating condition spread by ticks. But now, after those 15 years of fighting, Ellie just had no more energy. She could barely stand up on her own.
Whoa,
Her
what
mind
the
was
fuck
kind
was
of
that?
always in this weird fog, and she just felt totally hopeless. And so Ellie had recently hired an end-of-life coordinator to help her plan for her death, and also to make sure nobody attempted to revive or resuscitate Ellie if she fell unconscious. Ellie really thought she was going to die any moment and just wanted it to happen in peace in California in her bed. But dying can be complicated, and Ellie, after moving to California, had laid in her bed for 3 days expecting to die, but didn't. And so, on June 14th, Ellie decided she would just get up, and with the help of her caretaker, she would just go for a walk in her new town. Every step was painful for Ellie as she clutched her caretaker's arm, but the sun was out, the sky was blue, and flowers were in bloom all around her, and just for a moment, Ellie suddenly realized she was feeling something she had not felt in a long time. She was feeling grateful to be alive. But that feeling was very short-lived, because as she stood on this sunny sidewalk in California, she suddenly felt something small and sharp smack into her forehead. And Ellie, she kind of looked up and realized it was a bee. Now, she was determined not to let an insect ruin this rare instance of happiness in her life. Ellie just kind of reached up and tried to swat it away. But when she looked up again, she noticed
I don't know
the
what
bee
to
was
do with the
still
roof.
there,
I messed
and
it up.
worse, there was now an entire cloud, a swarm of bees over her head that were descending down on her. And as this happened, Ellie's caretaker, who saw the swarm, screamed, let go of Ellie, and ran away from her. And so poor old Ellie, who couldn't even stand up on her own, was forced to fall to the ground and kind of cover her head with her hands to try to protect herself. But within seconds, these bees had descended on her and were stinging her head, her ears, her face. I mean, she was getting destroyed. And these were not normal bees. These were African killer bees that were known for stinging their victim dozens of times. And Ellie was fiercely allergic to bee stings. And so instead of dying a peaceful death in her bed, Ellie was now going to die a viciously painful, awful public death out on the sidewalk all by herself. Ellie's life had started out with so much promise. By the time she was just 18 years old, she had already earned her PhD in physics. And then by 1996, when she was 27 years old, Ellie and her husband had 3 beautiful children, and they had moved into their dream home in New York's Westchester County. Her life really seemed perfect. But that same year they moved into their dream home, Ellie suddenly noticed there was this rash at the top of her thigh, and it kind of looked like a red bullseye. And Ellie had chalked it up to, some sort of weird spider bite and not thought much of it, not realizing that that bullseye marking is actually the calling card for ticks who carry Lyme disease. That's what they leave behind after they bite you. But Ellie didn't know that, and so not long after seeing this rash, Ellie began having night sweats and night shakes. She had these flu-like symptoms that didn't go away for months, and it left her totally exhausted and discouraged. Doctors told her that she could have arthritis, or fibromyalgia, or MS, or heart failure, or some other horrible condition, but it was ultimately a park ranger that Ellie just happened to meet one day who recognized that that rash she described at the top of her leg was very likely because she had been bit by a tick that had Lyme disease, and now all of these symptoms, that seemed like Lyme disease too. And then when Ellie went into the doctor and said, I think I have Lyme disease, they said, yep, you do. But now the disease has progressed so far, it's basically too late for you. And so for years, Ellie wasn't able to work or really even be a mother because of this disease.
Alright, how did I mess it up here?
Eventually, her marriage fell apart and ended in bitter divorce. And so this disease really had just kind of wrecked Ellie's life. And so at the 15-year mark of having this disease, she decided, you know what, enough is enough. I'm going to California and I'm going to die on my own terms. But Ellie had envisioned a peaceful death in her bed, not an agonizing death caused by a barrage of African killer bee stings out on a sidewalk in some random town in California. The attack on Ellie lasted maybe about a minute, but it was the longest minute of
I have
Ellie's
no
life.
idea how I
The
fucked
pain
up.
was just unimaginable. And then after all the bees had left, Ellie's caretaker actually came running back over to her, scooped her up, and began running with her back to the car. And as Ellie was getting carried, Ellie realized her caretaker was probably going to take her to the hospital, and she didn't want that. Even though she had had that kind of nice moment before the bee stings when she was looking around at this beautiful town and the sun was out and the flowers were out, that wasn't enough to inspire her to want to live. She still, deep down, did just want to die.
I probably
So she
placed the
figured,
other
with
roof
these bee
wrong,
stings,
maybe?
I'm going to have an allergic reaction any minute now, and that's going to take me out, and I just want it to happen so I can be done. And so Ellie made her caretaker drive her back to the house and put her in bed, and then Ellie laid there waiting to die. But 3 days later, and Ellie had not died yet. In fact, she actually felt the best she had felt in years. There had been no discernible allergic reaction to all of these bee stings all over her head, and all the chronic pain and discomfort that she normally felt all the time from Lyme disease was gone. And after doing some research about bee stings and about Lyme disease, Ellie came across this 1997 study done in Australia that found the active ingredient in some wasp and bee stings was powerful enough to kill the bacteria that causes Lyme disease. But no one had ever really researched this because it was totally unethical to release a swarm of bees on a critical Lyme disease patient. But in Ellie's case, this happened on its own, and it really did cure her. The bee stings literally saved her life. And since her bee attack, Ellie has become the leading advocate for bee venom as a treatment for Lyme disease.
What the fuck?
I am so
Corn
excited
didn't even
to
grow
announce
here. What do you
we
mean?
Here at Ballin
Okay.
Studios have a brand new show that is live right now for free on all podcast platforms. It's called Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, and as you might have guessed, it's about medical mysteries. Take, for example, the very first episode of the show called Ashes to Ashes. It's about this adult son who goes to check on his father who lives in the woods by himself. And when he gets to his dad's house, he goes inside and the power's off. And there's this
How?
weird gooey substance on everything, the furniture, the walls, food everywhere. And the son, he calls out for his dad. He can't see his dad. His dad doesn't call back. And so the son leaves and
I
gets
think I know what it
help.
is, actually.
And when help arrives, they search his
Or
father's
not.
house and they find something in the very back of the house that is far more bizarre and shocking than the gooey substance on the walls. Their discovery would quickly become one of the most talked about medical mysteries of all time. Again, this story is called Ashes to Ashes. It's episode number 1 on Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, which is a podcast that is new and free and available everywhere. New episodes of Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries will come out every Tuesday. But if you have no patience and you just want to listen to a whole bunch of episodes right now, you can listen to 8 episodes of Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries on Amazon Music. Again, the show is called Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries, and it's available right now everywhere for free. In the late afternoon of May 1st, 2016,
What did I do
13-year-old
wrong?
Shoaib Ahmed and his 9-year-old brother, Abdul Rashid, chased a soccer ball across the dusty plain near their little rural town in Pakistan. Abdul, who was very athletic and quick on his feet, managed to kick the ball past the defender and then kicked a line drive shot right at the net, but at the last second the goalie jumped and blocked the shot. And so Abdul threw his hands up in exasperation, but even though he was frustrated he missed a shot, he was having a blast. He loved playing soccer with his brother and the neighborhood kids. But as much fun as he was having, Abdul at some point looked up and he noticed the sun was starting to set behind the mountains. And immediately when he saw that, the expression on his face went completely deadpan. And then he looked over at his brother, Shoaib, who also had noticed the sun was setting. And by this point, Shoaib was already rushing over to Abdul. He grabbed Abdul's hand, and the two brothers, without a word to their friends, who were just kind of standing there watching, they took off and just hustled back towards their home. The brothers made it to their home, but on the porch, Shoaib, the older brother, just collapsed onto the ground with his arms and legs going totally stiff and his jaw locking up to the point where he couldn't even speak. And Abdul, instead of trying to help his brother, just stepped clear over him and ran into the house and made it to his bed just in time for him to also collapse, but onto the bed with his arms and legs being just as stiff as his brother's and his jaw also being locked so he couldn't even speak. And then moments later, the boy's father would scoop Shoaib off the porch, carry him into the bedroom, and put him in a bed, cover him up, and then the father would rotate Abdul, who was on his stomach, over onto his back, and he put the covers over him, and then the father just left and got into his own bed and went to sleep. And this was a typical night in this family's household. The next day, a convoy of fancy cars descended on this little village where Shoaib and Abdul lived. And in these vehicles were all these scientists from Pakistan's Institute of Medical Sciences, and they had heard about the boys' nightly bizarre collapses, and they wanted to find out if the condition was real. Now, if the scientists had arrived in the village before sunrise, they would have found Abdul and Shoaib still in their beds in a semi-comatose state, unable to move, but it was almost noon by the time the scientists arrived, and so when they saw the two boys, they were outside, goofing around and
just take
playing,
the L on it.
acting like everything was totally fine. In the village, neighbors referred to Abdul and Shoaib as the solar boys because they were only normal and active and like the other kids
Solar
during the daylight
boys.
hours when the sun was up.
That's fucked
At
up.
night, they would become totally paralyzed and mute. Now, the villagers saw this happening, but they didn't really believe it necessarily. They thought maybe the kids were making it up to get attention, or maybe they were doing it as like a grift to get people to donate money to the family. But Shoaib and Abdul's father completely denied this and said they had not made any money from what was happening to his sons, and all they wanted to do was just figure out what was wrong with them so they could help them. The scientists would talk to Abdul and Shoaib's father first, and he would explain to them that really since Abdul and Shoaib were very little, they had been suffering from these nightly paralysis events. And so with the family's permission, these scientists got to work. They collected blood and urine samples, not just from Shoaib and Abdul, but from the entire family. And then also the scientists tested Abdul and Shoaib's balance and coordination, obviously during the daytime, and the boys both did completely fine. And then as sunset approached, the scientists just stood there and watched as Abdul and Shoaib slowly lost control of their bodies and became
Oh,
paralyzed.
that's so horrible, man.
And then throughout the night, the scientists just continued to watch them, and the boys did not move at all. And then when the scientists attempted to kind of move their limbs for them, they were so rigid, almost like rigor mortis after you die, that they really couldn't move their limbs at all. And then the next morning, as the scientists were watching, the sun came up, and it was like suddenly Abdul and Shoaib were totally back to normal. They popped out of bed with a smile on their face, able to move around, no problem. And so to the scientists who watched this go on, they were left thinking, okay, there's no way these kids could be faking this.
Nice.
Like, no one could fake this. This is real. But the scientists really didn't have any new information to pass to the family because, the boys' blood and urine samples came back completely normal, and they
Thank you
had
for
passed
that.
all of their balance and coordination tests. And so it seemed like, Abdul and Shoaib should be totally normal, healthy boys, but they just weren't, and these scientists didn't know why. Now, these scientists were not the first group of people who had tried to solve the mystery of the solar kids. For years, their father had been trying to find someone who could help them, but he was having no success. Doctors in the nearest hospital to their village were convinced that the boys had a rare illness that made them extremely tired only a couple of hours after waking up in the morning. But Abdul and Shoaib had loads of energy all day long. It was only when the sun came down that they became totally paralyzed. And so the father didn't believe those doctors were really taking this that seriously. The imam at a local mosque was convinced the boys were possessed by demons, and so he organized an exorcism where a group of religious leaders basically tapped on the boys with sticks while chanting in rhythm and dousing them with holy water, but that didn't work. And so the family was
onto something?
close to giving up on ever finding help for their sons. But then in April of 2016, so a month before that team of scientists descended on the village to research the boys, a TV news reporter from Pakistan's version of CNN came to the village to interview the family because this reporter had heard about this strange condition these boys had. And this interview was seen by millions and millions of people, including Pakistan's most esteemed and influential doctor, a man named Dr. Javed Akram, who happened to be the vice chancellor of Pakistan's Institute of Medical Sciences. Dr. Akram had never heard of such a strange condition, and so he was the one who ordered those team of scientists to go to the village and research this family. And after those scientists came back and checked in with Dr. Akram, It was clear they had not had a sort of breakthrough moment with regards to what was going on with these boys, but they were very convinced that this was a real condition. And so Dr. Akram decided that he and his team would just continue to study this family until they figured out what the heck was going on with these two boys. And finally, a year later, in May of 2017, Dr. Akram believed he had figured out what was wrong with them, and he even had a solution. But his solution was so simple that Dr. Akram actually kind of second-guessed himself, thinking, this is too good to be true. So the doctor decided he would run one more experiment just to test his theory and make sure he really was correct. And so Dr. Akram flew Abdul, Shoaib, and their father out to his institute in Islamabad, and that night, Dr. Akram watched as the two boys slowly slipped into paralysis as the sun went down. But this time, as soon as the paralysis was clearly beginning, Dr. Akram gave each of the boys a pill. And 40 minutes would go by, and suddenly Abdul, who was totally mute and laying there still, broke into a smile, and then he raised his right leg. And then Shoaib, right next to him, he too smiled and turned his head. And then 20 minutes after that, both boys were up on their feet, totally fine, laughing and joking, because they had never really done anything at night. They were always paralyzed as soon as it started to get dark. It would turn out Dr. Akram and his team had discovered a very strange mutation in Abdul and Shoaib. Our brains naturally produce all sorts of chemicals that keep them running, and one of those chemicals is called dopamine. Dopamine does several things, but one of those things is it controls muscle movement. The mutation that Dr. Akram and his team had discovered was that the boys' genes were mistakenly shutting off dopamine production every single night, and so that was why they were becoming totally paralyzed. This mutation was the result of a series of complex genetic mistakes, but the fix was actually quite simple. The pill that Dr. Akram gave Abdul and Shoaib was just a dopamine pill, and what it did is it basically just turned the boys' bodies back on. And so Dr. Akram and his team had discovered quite possibly the world's rarest disease, only afflicting one family. But fortunately, they had also found the cure too, and so Abdul and Shoaib, from that day forward, lived totally normal lives by taking their dopamine pills every night. On the evening of July 3rd, 1992, 35-year-old George Decker was cooking in the kitchen inside of the apartment that he shared with his girlfriend in Jasper, Indiana. And as George cooked, he began to cough. At first, George thought it was just a little tickle in his throat that would go away, but as he continued to cough, this feeling, this sensation in his throat that was making him cough was only getting worse and worse. And this cough was not a normal cough. It was a deep, guttural, kind of rough-sounding cough that really hurt as he did it, and it kind of scared George, like he had never heard himself make this sound before. And in the other room, George's girlfriend, Juanita, she heard this very odd-sounding cough, and so she came out into the kitchen to see what was going on. And when she got there, she found George leaning on the counter, barely able to catch his breath because he was coughing so much. And this was totally out of character for George. He wasn't sick. He didn't have some sort of respiratory problem. He didn't smoke cigarettes. He did work in a metal shop where he melted down aluminum and poured it into different molds, but he always followed all the safety precautions. He wore a mask, he did all the things you're supposed to do to make sure he didn't inhale anything toxic. And so there was really no good reason why George would suddenly be having this unbelievable coughing fit. And so as Juanita kept asking George, hey, are you okay? Can I do anything? George, he can't even talk. He just pulled a handkerchief out of his pocket and he put it over his mouth as he continued to cough. And then when he pulled the handkerchief away, it was clearly covered in blood. Now, George was quick to kind of put the handkerchief back in his pocket, not wanting to deal with the fact that he was coughing up blood. But Juanita, she saw the blood and said, okay, George, I don't know what's going on, but you are going to the hospital right now. Now, George, even though he couldn't talk because he was coughing so much, clearly did not want to go. And he kind of resisted Juanita pretty aggressively. He did not want to go. But Juanita finally grabbed him and literally dragged him through the house, out the front door, and down into their car. And then just a few moments later, they were on their way to the hospital located a few miles away. By the time they actually parked in front of the emergency room at this hospital, George's cough had actually died down a little bit, and so now George was being really insistent that it was totally pointless to go to the hospital, that they did not need to be here, take me back home, this is ridiculous. But Juanita really pressed him and said, you can't goof around with coughing up blood, you have to go in there. And so finally George,
somehow
totally
this ended up
annoyed by this, relented. He got out of the car.
I'm so garble. I
and
hate it.
walked
I
to the
hate it.
hospital, and then when they went in the front doors of this emergency room, a nurse came up to greet them and see what was going on. And George kind of inexplicably pushed the nurse, like, to get away from me. I don't need your help. And Juanita, she was so embarrassed and tried to apologize. And the staff just kind of rolled with it and just kind of gave him his space. And then for the rest of the time they were there, the staff basically only talked to Juanita, while George sat in the corner with his arms crossed, unwilling to talk or give them any information. Toward the end of this hospital visit, the doctor would prescribe George some antibiotics for what he called an upper respiratory infection, and then the doctor asked George if he was willing to stay the night so they could observe him and make sure he really was okay. But George flatly refused. He got up, turned around, and practically ran out of the hospital. And Juanita said, I'm so sorry, and she followed after him. Over the next couple of days, George would take these antibiotics that he was prescribed, but they really did not make a difference. He continued to have these huge coughing fits, and even worse than that, something Juanita noticed was George's skin was clearly turning blue, in particular on his arms, his hands, his fingertips, and on his face. And so finally, about a week after that first visit to the ER, Juanita, she looked at George and just felt like he looks so bad. He has to go back. They have to check him again. And so Juanita was able to, again...
it's going to be the same
George
thing.
to go to the hospital. He was very
Oh.
resistant to the idea. But now he was so physically weakened and drained from whatever was going on, he just kind of went with whatever Juanita wanted. And this time, when they went to the hospital, they would give George a chest x-ray, and it would reveal George had pneumonia
there might be a way,
in both of his
maybe.
lungs. This
I doubt it.
explained why he was coughing so much, and it also explained why his skin was turning blue. Because of this infection in his lungs, his body was not getting enough oxygen, and when that happens, it leads to a condition known as cyanosis, which turns your skin blue. But when doctors tried to figure out what was actually causing George's pneumonia, they immediately ran into a brick wall. Usually, pneumonia is caused by bacteria, viruses, or some other microscopic invader, and doctors can test a patient's mucus to determine which one it is. But when they tested George's mucus, they couldn't find any evidence of anything that would cause pneumonia. The doctors also ruled out aluminum pollution because he did work in a metal plant and could have been inhaling the aluminum when he melted it down, but he was negative for that. And then also doctors began looking into all these crazy other possibilities like strange fungus that maybe George had come in contact with that caused this, or very rare viruses and bacteria. But no matter what the doctors thought of, when they tested George, it would come back negative. And so, with the exception of his x-ray that clearly showed he had pneumonia, every other test they ran on George made it seem like he was a healthy guy. And so George would spend weeks in the hospital with doctors and nurses constantly trying to figure out what was wrong with him, but
how are we going to fix
succeeding.
This gap?
And as each day went by, George's condition got worse and worse, until finally he was put on a ventilator because his lungs actually just didn't work on their own. And so a ventilator basically forces air into the patient's body. But no matter how much oxygen they pumped into George's body, he continued to have these terrible coughing fits, and his skin stayed blue. Finally, in October, so 3 months after George had first developed this coughing fit, he would pass away. George's doctors were totally baffled. It did not make sense what had happened to George. He was young and healthy, and then something that was totally powerful and aggressive had wiped him out. And so the doctors knew they needed to figure out what that thing was and how to cure it before other people died from the same mystery illness. On October 8th, so 5 days after George passed away, an Indiana pathologist named Dr. Daniel C. Weaver, who was known for his ability to figure out unexplained deaths like George's, was called to the hospital where George died to perform George's autopsy. And when Dr. Weaver began the autopsy and looked inside of George, he could not believe how just absolutely ruined George's lungs were. Healthy lungs are sort of like cotton candy. The tissue is light and airy, which is perfect for transferring the oxygen we breathe throughout our bodies. But George's lungs were thick and heavy, and they were lumpy with scar tissue. I mean, they were totally useless. And so Dr. Weaver knew, George basically suffocated to death. But now the question was, why? Dr. Weaver would run into the same obstacles as all the other doctors when he attempted to find contamination inside of George's lungs. There was nothing to see. In fact, at the end of the autopsy, Dr. Weaver had basically learned nothing as to why this happened to George. In frustration, after this autopsy was over, Dr. Weaver went to George's medical records and just began reading through them, and it was at this point that he saw something very odd that other doctors clearly had seen too, but they must have thought it was not important. At that very first ER visit, Juanita had told nurses and doctors that George, before he had begun coughing in the kitchen, he had been in a great mood. And generally speaking, George was just a very positive and upbeat person. But she said once he started coughing, it was like he transformed into somebody else and became mean and nasty. And Juanita had to practically drag him to the hospital. And then also there was a note in the file about how George had walked through the doors and pushed that admissions nurse. And so Dr. Weaver thought to himself, maybe George's belligerence was not just him being a jerk, but maybe he had ingested something toxic that was affecting obviously his lungs and also his brain, and that was causing him to behave this way. And so Dr. Weaver called the manager of the metal shop where George had worked to try to ask him if there were other chemicals or toxins inside of the plant that maybe George had been exposed to. But the manager just did not want to talk about any of that. Instead, he just wanted to talk about basically how awful George was as a
Building
person.
is so bad.
The manager clearly did not like George, and he began talking about how George was obsessed with making money at all costs, and that in addition to working in the metal plant, George had all these kind of sketchy, kind of borderline illegal side jobs to make more money. And then at some point, the manager just began talking about this one particular potential scam that George was involved in that had to do with little bits of silver and gold. And the doctor at this point is not really even listening. He just wants to get off the phone with this guy because it's obvious the manager is not really trying to help. He's just trying to bash George. But at some point, the manager, in detailing this gold and silver scam, mentioned something that piqued the doctor's interest. And suddenly the doctor was really intently listening to this manager and actually began taking notes and asking clarifying questions about this particular scam that George was apparently involved in. And then when Dr. Weaver hung up the phone with this manager, he felt pretty confident that he had actually figured out what had happened to George. The clues had all been there the whole time. George's blue skin and his rude and violent behavior at the ER, but nobody had put them together correctly because the cause of what was happening to George was so weird, no one would have ever thought of it on their own. On the night that George first began coughing in the kitchen, he was not cooking dinner like everybody assumed. He was actually cooking teeth, like human teeth. The metal shop manager told Dr. Weaver on the phone about the scam that George was involved in that had to do with little bits of gold and silver. And the manager explained to Dr. Weaver that George was going to all of these local dentist offices and he was collecting all of their discarded teeth. What George wanted was teeth that had fillings in them because some of the fillings, especially for older patients, were made from gold and silver. George would then literally cook the teeth until he was able to extract the gold and silver. Now, if he had just been cooking teeth with gold fillings, he'd probably still be alive. But because George also was cooking the teeth with silver in them, during that process of cooking the silver teeth, mercury gas was released, and George would inhale the gas. And mercury gas is deadly. And so the gas went into George, it ravaged his lungs, and it also created these massive mood swings and mental disturbances, which explained why he became so nasty and mean when he got to the ER. Also, ingesting high levels of silver, which George was doing as well, can turn your skin blue. So, in the end, George did not die from pneumonia. He died from mercury poisoning. So, that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's Medical Mystery Stories, be sure to tune in to our brand new podcast called Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries that is available wherever you get your podcasts right now. Again, it's called Mr. Ballin's Medical Mysteries. In 2005, in a little town in Illinois, 3 people, 2 men and a woman, walked into this strange living room inside of an apartment where on the ground was the
Bro, this
circle
is
of
so
candles.
annoying. The
And
building
trio,
system in
without
this game
saying
is
anything,
kind of
just
garble,
marched
man.
into this circle of
It's
candles,
taking every
took
bone
seats
in my
cross-legged on the
body to
ground,
just
all
not,
looking
like,
inward toward
quit
each
right
other.
now.
Then, after sitting there for a second, it was like suddenly the air in the room seemed to change, and when that happened, the woman began to speak. Except it wasn't her voice. It was like this dark, guttural voice that almost sounded like a man speaking, but it was clearly coming out of her mouth. But the 2 men who were sitting in the circle watching this woman, they were expecting this, and so they sat there listening intently for their instructions. And then after they got their instructions, the 2 men waited for the woman to stop talking, and when she did, she handed them a special tool for the ritual, and then the 2 men stood up, they said their goodbyes, they turned around, marched outside, hopped in the car, and began driving towards their target. But before we get into that very bizarre story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, when the like button has just finished raking up all of their fallen leaves in their yard, break out your leaf blower and obliterate all of their piles. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Just before midnight on March
Yeah, no,
22nd, 2005,
it's frustrating as fuck,
38-year-old
but
Rick Eck knocked on the front door
Mr.
of
Ballin
an
keeping me
apartment
alive.
in the tiny Midwestern
And I'm about to
farm
finish, so
town of
then I'm
Claremont,
about to get off.
As Rick waited for the door to open,
And
he could
then-
barely stand still because he was so excited.
And then I can finally sleep.
about
Because
what
I've
he was
been
going to be doing.
waiting on, like, finishing this for a
Finally,
long
the door
time.
swung open, and Rick
And
saw
it was
right
bothering
in
me
front of him
more.
this very skinny and gaunt-looking woman with dark hair and dark eyes staring back at him. Her name was Irene.
It's just that I like building in
34
every
years
game
old,
pretty much.
and by
Like,
day,
a lot
she
more
worked at
than
Walmart, but at night,
like
she
any other
became
thing
the
that's in the
real
game.
version of herself.
But
She
just
was
in
a
this
witch
game,
who
the
actually
building,
led
it's
a
kind of
group
like
of witches
weird.
known as a coven that Rick was a part of.
So
Without saying anything,
makes it a little more
Irenia
frustrating.
motioned for Rick to follow her into her apartment, and then Irenia turned and began walking away. And Rick, before stepping over the threshold, he paused for a moment and just turned to the guy he had brought with him, a tall, muscular man named David Lindner.
see
And Rick
why
just kinda
did it
nodded at David, and David nodded back, and then the 2 of them
why
walked
did it place
inside.
all the way up there?
As Rick and David followed Irenia into her apartment, Rick still could barely contain his excitement. He had only joined this coven recently, about a year and a half ago, and so witchcraft, which is something they were going to be doing that night, was kind of new to him, but it was very exciting. Rick had been inspired to become a witch and join this coven after watching the Harry Potter movies, and so he was
Oh, not enough
hopeful that
materials. I was
tonight
like,
would go
what am I
something
missing?
like Harry Potter. And Rick knew David, the guy he had brought
Give me
along,
that shit.
was this very powerful warlock, which is a male witch, and so he figured, you know, if David's here, this is bound to go to plan. Rick just hoped he'd be able to keep up
Oh, wait, I'm
with
gonna need
David,
more
or
wood.
at least play some sort of meaningful support role. Irenia eventually led Rick and David down this dark hallway to
For
the small
real,
living
dude.
room, where in the middle of the floor was
Actually, I
arranged
gotta
with
answer the
candles.
text.
And
Thanks
as
for
soon as
reminding
Rick and
me.
David stepped into the room with Irenia, they were hit with this powerful smell of incense that had been burning in the room, and also there was all this smoke hovering in the air from the various things that Irenia had been burning in preparation for tonight's event. Rick, David, and Irenia walked quietly into the middle of this circle of candles,
Alright.
and they sat down cross-legged in a circle facing each other, and then they got ready to begin. Life in the town of Claremont was normally very quiet and peaceful. I mean, this is
Like,
a town that literally has more cornfields
hey,
than people, and
My
Claremont
lady,
was
I
over
need to
100
relieve
miles
my
away
stress from
the
all
city.
that Fortnite
But
Lego
beneath the
I've been
calm
playing.
exterior, Claremont had a dark side. Amongst the 200
Very,
or
very
so residents
stressful.
of Claremont were several very dark witches. Not this coven, not Irenia, Rick, and David. They were the good guys. The dark witches, they were kind of out and about in this town and doing bad things, like practicing evil magic and evil witchcraft. And so this coven, led by Irenia, was actually in place to try to combat
See if I
these
can
evil witches in their midst.
fill this up with
Tonight,
wood right here.
Rick, David, and Irenia were going to attempt to perform their most ambitious and important magic yet. The coven was going to attempt to break a powerful hex,
Nobody-
which is kind of
Nobody
like a
cares
curse.
about this little
And
corner.
this hex was cast by a person who might very well be the worst of all the dark witches in Claremont, a 16-year-old girl named Lindsay Cassinger.
What can I put
As
there?
Rick
I can
sat
put some
cross-legged
random
in the
stuff.
middle of the circle, he
Some
found
random,
himself
some
staring
random.
at the two slightly bigger candles that sat in the dead center of the circle, that were basically right between Rick, David, and Irenia. And David, as he stared at these two candles, he saw etched in each of the candles' bodies were words. On one candle it said
Sure.
Lindsay,
That
and on the
looks
other
good.
candle it was etched baby, because it would turn out this very evil dark witch, Lindsay, was pregnant. And so instead of having to combat one dark soul, the coven would have to combat two, because Lindsay and her baby were kind of intertwined. Now, before this night, the coven had attempted several times to try to break this hex that Lindsay had cast. And the coven believed initially this hex was actually cast directly at Irenia, because Irenia was suffering from things like depression and anxiety and not finding love. And so, of course, that had to be a product of this curse. And as the coven had continued to try
Campfire
and
Stories
fail
by
at breaking
Mike
this hex,
Burnfire.
the hex had only become more
See?
powerful.
Well, I
and
haven't
spread
listened to
from
Mr. Bowling in a
Irenia
minute,
to other
so I think I'll
witches
get
in this
tired.
coven who actually
But
were not present
I'm gonna
this
search it up right
particular
now,
night,
just so I
including
can
a
keep a
20-year-old
tab on it.
woman who began complaining of depression and ever-worsening headaches, which of course had to be because of this hex. And so that was why, on this night, the coven had decided to really beef up their attack on this hex. And so that was why Rick had gone out
Alright,
and brought in
I got it on my
David,
tabs.
the experienced warlock from St. Louis, Missouri, who claimed he had broken a hex.
I didn't know you
before,
like all
and
like
he could
listening
do it
to
again
scary
for them.
stories and shit.
As Rick, Irenia, and Dave all sat
It's
in
like
a
the only thing
circle,
I do.
they looked at each other, and then they began chanting in unison to bring out the dead, to join them in the living room right now. And as they began this chant, Rick found himself intensely staring at those two candles with Lindsay and Baby on them. And as he stared at the flames dancing across the top of them, Rick started to feel like he was kind of drifting off into a trance-like state.
Ooh.
He knew that based on his prior teachings from Irenia, the leader of this coven, that this must be what it feels like when the spirit world opens up, which means the dead really were coming into the room. And then, as Rick is kind of dealing with this trance-like state, he heard Irenia begin to talk, but it wasn't her normal voice. It was the slow and deep-sounding voice, almost like something had inhabited her body and taken it over and was now speaking through her mouth. And Irenia, in this kind of slow and strange voice, she would tell Rick and David that the curse is still growing. And then she would say something that totally caught Rick by surprise. She said, again in that slow, strange voice, that the hex now was also on Rick and his entire family, and if they didn't break this hex immediately, Rick and his family would all perish. And when Rick heard this, he's still in this trance-like state, but his heart began racing because he didn't know this hex could potentially affect his loved ones. And so this was a really big deal. They needed to end this hex tonight. Rick listened intently as Irenia began to say in this strange voice what their plan was for that night to break this hex. Basically, Rick and David were going to perform a sacred ritual, and Irenia, she began to say to the spirits in the room that Rick and David, they were ready, but they needed help. And so after she said this, she went quiet, and so too did Rick and David, and they're all just sitting there kind of waiting for something to happen. And then after about a minute of just total silence, Irenia began to speak again, still in this strange, slow, bizarre voice, but Rick and
Fuck,
David
actually,
knew
I'm gonna do
now
this
it was a
tomorrow.
different voice coming out of
Oh.
her. Now Irenia was speaking on
Alright.
behalf of the spirit world that was in the room with
I
them.
mind it.
And Irenia, she would say,
I
and
mind it all.